Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Has anyone here read the book yet? Okay, because I read it. It's a pretty amazing book in a lot of ways. The book covers a lot of issues. So I think our reviewer will be able to cover many of them because Jim O'Rourke, he works at St. Peter's. He's the head of the Respiratory Therapy Services. He's on the Committee for Ethical Issues. He's on the Committee for Disaster Preparedness. And he has a degree in theology, so I think that covers. I think that covers everything in this book, because this book gets into a lot of things. So, Jim O'Rourke. The book is called 5 Days at Memorial by Sheri Fink. So here's Jim.
Thank you very much.
Let me show you.
I'd like to just start out just giving an overall review of the book. Okay, when I read a book, I try to avoid reading the stuff on the back, all right? And I even try to avoid reading the inside cover if it's something that, I want to see what it's all about. And when Joe handed me this assignment, I said, well, I'll stay away from all this. I also did not read the entire book. I listened to it on Audible, an Audible presentation. I'm a member of Audible, so I get a credit per month. I don't know if anybody here in this group does that at all, but up to one book a month for the subscription rate that I have. And so I downloaded this book and listened to it in my car on the way back and forth to work. So it wasn't until I was about 3/4 of the way through the book where I realized the author was a physician, all right? And outside of being a good investigative reporter, which is what certainly comes through very clearly in the book, she also is a physician that does handle conflict areas. She's been involved in conflict areas. As a matter of fact, her first book, Sheri Fink wrote a book called Disaster Hospital, or I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was about the ethnic cleansing situation in Bosnia in one of the hospitals there. She also has been involved in many rescue missions throughout the world. After this, as she was compiling her notes and so forth, Haiti struck, and so she did go to Haiti, and she was also in New York City last year with Hurricane Sandy, and a lot of this comes out in the epilogue of the book, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But Sheri Fink is a Stanford-trained MD, and like I said, has worked with disaster relief and has worked in conflict areas. One thing she does very well is that she sticks to the facts as she uncovers them in the story, all right? She doesn't put a lot of her own experiential or personal knowledge base into it. All right, so that's why I said I really didn't realize it was a physician that was writing this book, other than that some of the medical things that were happening, especially with the respiratory patients, and since I'm involved and have been for several years with patients with respiratory critical care and so forth, I thought her descriptions were pretty right on and accurate. But I did not realize that she was a physician at the time I was either listening or reading this. She does not apply any professional commentary until the epilogue at the end, all right? Now, if you remember Hurricane Katrina, it occurred toward the end of August in 2005. They had significant advance warning that a bad hurricane was coming. All right, they weren't exactly sure where it was going to make landfall. All right, it was over the course of a weekend, and the hurricane hit on a Sunday evening. Now, most hospitals, especially a hospital like Memorial, or the former Baptist Memorial in New Orleans, are probably going to have their lowest patient occupancy on a Sunday evening. I know that's usually very true at St. Peter's because Monday and Tuesday the beds fill up with surgical patients and so forth. And as I was reading this, I found a lot of similarities between the hospitals, St. Peter's and Memorial, not in terms of how they responded to disasters, because fortunately St. Peter's we haven't had a disaster of this proportion happen, but in terms of the types of patients to take care of, they have a neonatal intensive care unit as well as we do. Baptist Memorial is not, or was not at the time, the regional trauma center, although they had a helipad on board. All right, they did have a helipad, but there was issues with that, and I'll talk about those in a few minutes. Baptist Memorial, or Memorial Hospital rather, it was formerly run by the Baptists and then was purchased by a private concern, made up of about 280, 290 beds, or at least that's how many were filled at the time of the storm. But also, there were another 60 beds in a private area of the hospital that was run by a company called Life Care, all right? Now, Life Care operates what's called an LTAC, a long-term acute care center. Long-term acute care centers, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I think they're a great idea, we don't have them in New York State. All right, if we have a patient at St. Peter's or if they have a patient at Albany Med that needs long-term acute care, all right, they may have to go to Springfield, Massachusetts, or there's also another one down in New Jersey. All right, they're not allowed to operate in New York State, and they're usually operated by for-profit organizations, where most of the hospitals, I think all the hospitals in New York State, are all non-for-profit. All right, so that's where I think you run into a little bit of the issues. They're not exactly full acute care. You're referred there because you need ongoing care with things like ventilator care, all right, or hemodialysis are probably the two biggest care things that these patients would require. So essentially, patients would be discharged from inside that hospital or even referred from other hospitals in the area to the LTAC that Life Care operated on the 7th floor of Memorial. Now, where it gets sticky is who's in charge and the administration control. The hospital administrators administrate the hospital, but this other company that's removed administer the Life Care section because it is a separate entity located within the hospital. The book basically reads, and I think it is an extension actually, of like a prolonged newspaper article, all right? Most of what is contained in the book, there's a condensed format in the New York Times Magazine, which Sheri Fink did win a Pulitzer Prize for, her reporting for that. The book basically is that plus all her notes, and she'd had over 500 interviews that she conducted in putting together all her research. I listened to, like I said, the audio version, and the narrator was Kirsten Potter, her name was. And unfortunately, she had a very monotone voice. It was almost like listening to a very elongated NPR report. All right? Okay, you know what I'm talking about then. She had a voice like an NPR reporter. I'm not knocking NPR. I know a lot of people love NPR. I listen to it myself. But sometimes those stories just get to be a little too long. So that was part of the difficulty in listening to this. The book is not for those who are weak in heart. It's very graphic in nature, describing these unbelievable, horrific conditions that occurred inside this hospital over the 5 days. All right. things got bad and just got progressively worse and worse and worse. Several characters are introduced in the story, all right? And it makes it a little difficult to follow because being more of a news reporter, Dr. Fink is not as strong on character development as maybe some other authors you might be more familiar with, you know. Although she does do a very good job, there's just so many people you kind of keep track of. Who was that doctor? Who was this nurse? But she does outline everybody in the book. I mean, she does have short bios and descriptions on all this large cast of real characters that were in this book. The primary characters that were individuals that were brought up on charges, all right? Well, they were arrested, but the charges were never, they couldn't get the grand jury to basically to indict them, all right? Was a Dr. Anna Poe. Dr. Anna Poe is a maxillofacial surgeon and ENT surgery specialist. A Sheri Landry, who was a critical care RN, and a Lori Boudreau, another RN. So these were the three individuals that were arrested, but there was no charges brought up on indictment, partially because of the failure of the district attorney's office in the prosecution, and very strong public outcry in defense of these individuals. Part two of the book, and it is broken into two parts. The part one is basically the build-up before the storm and the 5 days after. Part two of the book talks about the legal arguments and the list of potential charges and the assembly of the grand jury and so forth. It's probably the lesser interesting part of the book. It was to me anyway. Being involved in healthcare and especially going to disaster preparedness meetings, you know, I was more interested in the actual disaster part of the story. So let's talk about the story, and let's talk about just what went on down in New Orleans. I mean, everybody's familiar with the great disaster Hurricane Katrina was, all right? And Sunday night for the hospital itself, outside of losing their primary power source from the city, hospital fared pretty well. They didn't do half bad. They were prepared. They had staff come in. One of the enticements, though, for staff to come in was, well, as long as you got a cage, you can bring your pets, and we'll keep them in a certain part of the hospital. All right? So that allowed people, because, you know, pets kind of get lost in severe storms and so forth. People at least had that assurance, and that was an incentive to come to work, the fact that you could bring your pet and store it on the hospital grounds. That proved to be a problem as time went on. One of the pictures, long before I even looked at this book, but I just remember from looking at news stories on the disaster, I forget who the reporter was, somebody from NBC or MSNBC, was standing on top of a, he was in a cemetery and standing on top of one of those buildings, you know, where because many of the patients are not buried in the ground, they're built in mausoleums. Thank you very much. Word searching there. They're contained in mausoleums. He's standing on top of a mausoleum, all right? And he's talking into his microphone, and the cameraman must have been on the same level or on a mausoleum across from him. The water is up to the top of the mausoleum, all right? Yet I'm looking over his shoulder above his head, and I see a boat going by. And it just made me realize just how deep this basin is of New Orleans, just how deep a basin it is. And the Army Corps of Engineers have done a lot of work to, try to protect that area with the whole entire levee system and pumps and all that stuff, but it was just overtaken by the storm. And one of the biggest problems at the hospital, like I said, was not the storm itself, but the flooding that occurred as the levees broke and as the storm waters and the tides continued to rise, and waters just coming up all over the place. Up to 15 feet of water in certain areas. I mean, that's deeper than the average deep end of any swimming pool you've ever been in. That's deep water, no doubt about it. The title of the book, 5 Days of Memorial, I thought was interesting from the disaster preparedness standpoint, because the Joint Commission, I don't know whether you're familiar with the Joint Commission, it's the accreditation board that a lot of hospitals subscribe to make sure that their I's are dotted, T's are crossed in terms of policies and procedures. And it enables them for reimbursement for Medicare, Medicaid, and that kind of thing if they come up with a good report card from the TJC or the Joint Commission. Joint Commission requires about 96 hours of supplies to be in a hospital in case the hospital were to have some form of a shutoff, all right, of supplies, all right? Well, they were there 5 days. That's 120 hours, all right? They just had a Joint Commission review, which actually they scored very well on it at Memorial Hospital. They did pretty good on their last Joint Commission review. There were a couple things the Joint Commission didn't catch, like the fact that the elevator that led to the heliport had absolutely no backup emergency power system. It was just running off the straight power. So the elevator to the heliport was shot. But then again, they didn't put any money into getting a backup power source because they didn't use the heliport. It hadn't been used in over 10 years. But in this particular situation, they needed it. Most hospitals, I would say, are good for 72 to 96 hours. And when you say that, it means they have to have enough portable oxygen supplies in case an oxygen system were to go down. That's usually 72 plus hours that we would have. Power and diesel fuel to run the generators, at least 96 hours worth of that. Food, drugs, you get to thinking of all laundry, fresh laundry, all this stuff. You add all this up, it means that the hospital has to inventory a large amount of stuff, or also have a system where they can be readily supplied. Well, this hospital is surrounded with a moat of water. Nobody can get in or out. No supplies could get in or out. It was an absolute disaster. All right, so the hospital itself became a self-contained area. They had power for a while until the generators ran out of diesel fuel. All right, the generators go down. Most hospital generator systems do not power air conditioning. All right, this is August in New Orleans. It's pretty hot. The internal temperature of the hospital got up to about 107, 113 degrees. Extremely high humidity, all right? Tired, overworked, exhausted staff, and several patients that are in need of a very high level of care. Again, the sickest hospital patients are the ones on Sunday night because they're the ones that don't go home, all right? It might be a fewer in total number, all right, but there were still several sick patients. The other thing that was the community, of course, so let's go to the hospital, they're above ground, all right? So what community people did go there kind of hung out in the lobby of the hospital. So there were about 2,000 people in the lobby of this hospital with nowhere to go, all right? When they finally, decided to try to evacuate some of the patients on this helipad. Well, first, they weren't sure whether it was going to hold the weight of the helicopters. The first individuals out were the babies in the neonatal intensive care unit, all right? And one of the problems is, okay, we get them out of here, where do we go? Katrina had an effect of over a 150-mile radius. Everybody was affected. All the hospitals in the area were affected. And if you send these helicopters out too far, all right, well, they're going to have to refuel for one, and so there has to be a refuel spot for them. Well, they're going to be gone for hours, all right? And a lot of people need to be rescued. All right, so it was very difficult. At least the babies got to where they needed to go. So the neonatal intensive care unit got evacuated quickly. But when it came to adults and adult patients, it got more difficult. Even, was it Tuesday or Wednesday, when the president went down and did his flyover? Well, guess what? When the president's flying over, the airspace is cleared. All right, so you had a good 6 hours where rescue helicopters could not be sent. Plus, evacuating hospitals, well, that was a great thing to do, but you had people on rooftops that needed to be evacuated. And most of the helicopters were not designed for transport of critical care patients. They were more designed for rescue, like the U.S. Coast Guard and some of the other military helicopters that were present. I mean, they were designed for rescue. They did a great job of pulling people off of roofs, but to get sick, critically ill patients out into a place where they could be cared for, all right, there was a point where that transportation had to stop. Water and food became a problem, although there were forgotten about stockpiles within the hospital, because the right people didn't realize, oh yeah, I forgot about all those pallets of bottled water in such and such an area. And they were found afterwards, all right? So people on the floors of the hospital are looking for something to drink for themselves and their patients. And there was the hospital did have supplies squandered away, but the right people weren't there to know what was available and where they were. So after about 4 days, the water supply basically is gone, all right? And there were messages out there to not use city water anyway because it was contaminated. And some people just ignored that. Dialysis patients, forgot about those. Dialysis patients need fresh water to run the dialysis machines, and a lot of it, all right? So granted, the water goes through deionizers and purifiers, all right, before it runs through the system that mixes with the blood that pulls all the biological end products out of the bloodstream. But you need a lot of water in order to do that. So dialysis schedules were kind of like bumped and held. And in a couple of cases, they just, prayed that the decontamination in the ionizers would do a good enough job to use the city water supply. Patients under these extreme heat conditions became extremely dehydrated. We're sweating like crazy. And to try to cool them, when the power finally went, no more fans. I mean, they're just waving fans on patients, anything handmade that they could use to try to cool patients. The critical patients, the very, very sickest of them all, became closer and closer to the brink of death. So here's where the tough decisions were made, all right? Now, Dr. Poe, all right, who kind of assumed charge, she kind of came up with her own triage process, all right, to meet this situation. And one point of disagreement I would have with her is she listed patients that had a DNR, a do not resuscitate order, as not to be transferred out, or the absolute last to go. All right. Now, DNR means do not resuscitate. If your heart stops, we're not going to defibrillate, or we're not going to do mechanical resuscitation. We're not going to administer resuscitative drugs. That's what DNR means. All right. But just because a patient is critically ill and very sick, all right, and has gone through this, does not mean that there's not viable potential life there. All right. What's very, very unclear in the book, all right, and certainly was unclear enough so that they could not bring forth charges. There was evidence in about 20 bodies of the presence of morphine and the presence of midazolam, which is Versed. All right. Now, these are two drugs, morphine especially, which is used to comfort and so forth patients that are in pain, but in very high doses, it stops breathing. Versed is an inducing agent, all right? Midazolam is an inducing agent. There'd really be no reason to administer that to a critically ill patient on any kind of continuous basis unless you were keeping them in a controlled coma situation, all right? There'd be no reason to be continuously administering that in several of these patients, especially the ones in the LTAC. And up to 9 patients in the LTAC, the LifeStar LTAC, had the presence of both drugs in their bodies on autopsy. All right? So there was talk of mercy killing amongst the doctors. All right? There was situations where certain people were seen going to the side and starting an IV and administering medications. And Dr. Poe was one of them, and the 2 nurses that were identified as well. Charges weren't brought, though. All right, they could not come up and determine the charges. And this is the most haunting part, I think, of this book, because we really don't know exactly what happened, all right? And, you know, from my little bit of experience with ethics, all right, I do sit on the ethics resource group. Mostly if I get called to investigate a situation, it's usually involving whether there's informed consent, all right? Well, in disaster situations, informed consent, all right, was tossed out the window with some of these patients, all right? And they weren't able to respond as to whether or not they wanted to have further treatment and so forth. In some of the situations, there was compassionate withdrawal of support. Now, that's different. That usually involves informed consent on the part of the patient or the patient's proxy. But again, up to 20 patients on the autopsies, and there was probably a total of 36 deaths, I believe. You know, some were just natural over the course, and it certainly probably were sped up by the fact of the decreasing amount of care and so forth that the patients received in that time frame. But you know, the question is ever present there: were these patients euthanized? All right, and that's a question that I can't answer. It's a question that Sheri Fink could not answer, and it's certainly, from a legal standpoint, the New Orleans District Attorney's Office could not answer. That's the haunting part of the book, I think. I mean, outside of some of the graphic nature of the story and so forth. What have we learned from Katrina? What have we learned from this experience at Memorial Hospital? Well, we ran into a lot of the same issues with generators drowning with floods at Columbia Presbyterian during Sandy, and also Bellevue Hospital Evacuations were needed there. Efforts were certainly much more organized, but the entire city of New York was not wiped out either, and neither was Long Island. All right? The entire city of New Orleans was greatly affected. All right? And there was no way in to rescue these waterlocked hospitals and healthcare centers. And there were several, there was an entire nursing home where the staff just left and left the patients behind. All right? So there's a lot of horror stories from Hurricane Katrina. This book just basically focuses on the one. That's basically all I have. If you have any other questions, I do know New York State has really taken, not so much from Katrina and 9/11, although 9/11 I think started a lot with security. Katrina made us more aware of the impact of severe storms. One of the biggest influence I've seen from the respiratory side is the threat of avian flu. And we also had the H1N1 situation a couple years back. New York State actually has in place, and you'll read this in the epilogue. Actually, the epilogue, in my opinion, is probably the best part of the book, because she talks about things that have happened since and so forth, and talks more of her opinions as being a physician. But New York State actually has a plan in place for ventilator rationing in case of a acute viral emergency. I know at St. Peter's and Albany Med probably has even more. We have at least 8 ventilators that were purchased by the state of New York, and we're not to use them as routine ventilators, but we are to use them for transport so that the staff is very familiar with them and how they work. We have 8 of them. All right, some of the smaller hospitals in the area have at least 4. Albany Med probably has a dozen or more. And there's still more ventilators sitting in a warehouse. When Sandy hit, I was getting calls twice a day, and actually our disaster preparedness team was meeting daily. What's the impact in New York? Do we have to brace ourselves for any patients being transported up here? Do they need ventilators and so forth? I have, whenever there's any kind of a threat anywhere in the country of an acute emergency, I'll get calls. How many ventilators do you have? How many do you have on hand? How many can you let go out of those 8? All right, and if I have to give up all 8 of those ventilators to the emergency. So, you know, fortunately, we have not had to do that. But it's a tough story. I think the New York Times article is a little more condensed, gets a little bit more to the point than the book itself. You know, if I were to give the book, I think I said 2.5 stars is what I would give the book, but the New York Times story, I would give 5 stars on it. It's a great story, the way it's told. There's also additional resources, and I saw these later on after I had finished the book, on the internet, several interviews with Sheri Fink, several interviews with Anna Poe, including 60 Minutes and so forth. They got into the act back in 2009, 4 years afterwards, when the New York Times article hit. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Yes?
I just wondered, where did they take the babies? So they got the babies out.
I forget exactly where. I think they went to a couple different hospitals.
They keep them in the state, or did
They kept them in the state, yeah. I do believe they kept them in the state.
Okay.
But the babies were the first to go, and the babies did, they went on Monday, I think, for the most part, Monday or Tuesday at the latest. So the babies got out, but still, it's still pretty precarious getting that many, you know, acutely ill neonatal babies out of there. Yes, yes.
I understand that there's been a huge infusion of federal funds for preparedness. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'd like to know, for example, New York State's plan. I assume we probably got one of the big allotments as far as the states go.
New York State has a lot of stuff on their website. all right?
Do you know exactly?
I don't know the full details of it all. I'm not the disaster preparedness individual. I'm just one of the people on the committee. Charlie Federici is our director for St. Peter's Health Partners. He speaks for all of St. Peter's. Scott Heller down at Albany Med, but a lot of that stuff is on the New York State Department of Health website.
One other question, and you might be able to answer that. You said that helicopter evacuation was sort of iffy because the helicopters weren't prepared to evacuate very sick people.
Well, because they were using military rigs. They were using.
Has there been an antidote to that? Has there been something as a follow-up that is preparing helicopters for that kind of rescue?
Patient-carrying helicopters, all right, can usually only carry one, maybe two individuals, all right? And you have a lot of risk during flight, you know, in terms of assessment and so forth. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but, you know, I've received patients from med flight, you know, at Albany Med when I worked there, you know, so, and they're extremely well trained, very, you know, the best paramedics work on med flight. But they're designed for one or two, not an entire unit of people, you know. So when you have several people, you need several helicopters to come and land. And of course, helicopters were getting tugged and pulled from several different directions, you know. There was one story in the book of, I forget, they needed to get somebody somewhere, but the pilot's time was up. I mean, these pilots have clocks ticking. They can't fly only a certain number of hours. And they had to land and refuel and get another pilot, all right, which cost them another couple of hours before they could get this individual where they needed to go to be treated. It cost them about an hour and a half. I thought that was an interesting story in the book. Anybody else?
How was the informed consent presented to the patients or their caregivers for the people who passed on?
For the people who
Passed on.
there wasn't any informed consent that I could determine in there, no. You know, they were using battleground tactics here, you know. I mean, the usual process is, you know, you fill out your informed consent at the hospital, and if you're conscious enough to do it, or you have a healthcare proxy, which a lot of people don't have, but it's very important, you know, that you have somebody that can make decisions. You know, usually should go to the direct next of kin, husband or wife, or, you know, when it gets down sometimes to the children, there can be a lot of disagreements. So, you know, there's nothing more important to have in hand than a healthcare proxy. Also, what we have in New York State is called the Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, MOST form. Now, a MOST form you wouldn't fill out unless your doctor said that you probably didn't have much more than a year to live, all right? The MOST form would spell out exactly what kind of treatment you would want, you know. It's not a DNR, that separate DNR would need to be ordered, but it does spell out exactly what kind of treatment that you would accept. And it's a great thing to have, you know, especially, you know, if you have if you're older, have a poor prognosis and so forth, to communicate regularly with your physician and keep your MOST form updated and bring that with you everywhere you go. You know, we try to get people in the hospital to complete them and hang on to them and make sure their primary care physician reviews it and update them. Anything else? Yes?
I think it's important to remember what New Orleans was like at this time. I mean, there were bodies floating down the street.
Certainly.
The people in the hospital were much better off than a lot of the people in the Ninth Ward.
In many respects, you are
in many
right.
respects. And if I were in that situation and drowning was a real option, I'd want very seven morphine.
And I think that is the thinking of many in the general public, because the general public, there was huge outcry about arresting Dr. Poe and these two nurses. Huge outcry, because those people experienced it too. And you know, I didn't get into it, but I mean, the book does talk about the horror story surrounding the hospital. There was an armed gang across the street that took over a federal credit union building, all right? And by the fourth day, they were afraid they were going to be invaded. You know, at the same time I'm reading this book, I also went and saw World War Z in the movie theater. And I'm thinking, a lot of similarities here. They weren't zombies, but boy, it got out of control. And it was dangerous, you know? So yeah, the hospital became somewhat of a safe haven, as horrible as the conditions were. It truly was. Yes?
What would you say were the ages of those 20 people that they're questioning? What were the ages?
I don't think she broke that down. I don't think there were any very young people. I mean, there were people in their 50s, all right?
Okay.
Since I'm 62, that's young to me now. But there was an individual who was awake and alert. But he was a grossly obese paraplegic that was in the hospital being evaluated for possible bowel surgery. All right, surgery that he never received or couldn't receive because of the storm and everything that went on, and they found his body with doses of morphine. And this guy was awake and alert and was joking with the nurses, you know, and actually was a very beloved patient, very understanding of the situation, not a complainer. Yes?
Not to change, but you alluded to it before. After this horrible tragedy, what would you say your disaster team, some major additions or changes you've made after like really looking at this? What else can we do? We can't change what happened.
Well, as far as what we do at St. Peter's and what's done locally, all right, there is coordination, because you have to have coordination of everything, all right? There are drills that are done on a fairly regular basis. I participate in what we call tabletops, all right, where we kind of sit around and take a imaginary situation, you know, give the details of it, and then we have to report on, well, how much of this do we have on hand, how much on that, how we're doing with staffing, and so forth. And the tabletops are actually very good because you get the experience of, what you may need to have to be prepared to have, all right? The state is constantly doing trainings and so forth. There are our emergency providers in the area, all the ambulance companies, fire, police, safety, and so forth, are all involved in this, all right? What makes this particular thing unique, I mean, we could have a disaster that could be localized at one particular hospital in the area. We could have that. It could be a flood. It could be a building failure or something, a building collapse. Plane crash into the building, something like that, all right? But if it doesn't affect greatly, you know, the traffic patterns and everything else and the ability to get these patients out. We have plans to receive patients. You know, we have St. Margaret's has a child, a ventilator-dependent program. All right, so when they first opened that program, I remember going to meetings and determining how many children that we could accept if there were some kind of building failure at St. Margaret's Home for Children. All right, so these plans are in place. I mean, I don't administer them. Our safety officer and our disaster preparedness officer do. I'm aware of them, and I pretty much know what I would do with my staff, given this situation, if a situation were to occur. But I think we're much better off today than we were back in 2005, and certainly much better off than we were back in 2001. I mean, especially for healthcare institutions, 9/11 really was a major wake-up call on how to respond. And even at that, 9/11 was a situation where you had much more in terms of the the first responder, and then the the unfortunate deaths and so forth of several first responders in 9/11. The hospitals itself, basically, St. Vincent's was one of them. St. Vincent's is closed now, but the hospital itself, processed dead bodies.
They were waiting to treat people.
And there was nobody to treat. Nobody to treat. All right. Yes, sir.
So up here, I take a look at Katrina and say, well, if we have a massive ice storm followed by a week of frigid weather, we could have potential for some same type of problems?
We're pretty prepared up here, though. We've dealt with ice storms, all right? Probably, I forget when it was, late 90s, I think you had the situation in Plattsburgh that ran through the northern Adirondacks. That was pretty severe. I mean, the problem there was getting people to the hospitals. The hospitals themselves were still pretty operable, but it's roads closed, trees down, and all that stuff. Getting people to the hospitals was a problem. That was true in Sandy for the most part too, except for the 2 New York City hospitals that had some flooding. I think with what was the other storm we had here? Irene. St. Mary's in Amsterdam flooded because they're close to the Mohawk and to the water down there, and they had basement area flooding. There was I worked at the Albany County Health Department back in the late 90s, and there was a very heavy rainstorm that resulted in a lot of flooding in the south end of Albany. Many of my coworkers lost their cars because of where they parked. But we had to move clinics and so forth, clinics that met in the basement of the health department. They had to be moved, but there was a plan in place. Things were taken care of. But something like this, this hospital is totally cut off and isolated, all right? And even if you could get people out, where the heck are you going to send them? That was the big problem here. Hopefully, we'll never see anything like that, but, we don't know exactly what went on in the Philippines recently. And they say that was worse. We haven't gotten, heard the full details of that. Haiti was another thing, hospitals collapsing, years before, and it's not put back together again. Yes?
On the very last page of the book, one of the persons on the grand jury that voted not to indict, said, well, we think a crime was committed here, we just don't know what it was.
I agree.
I think if the levels of those 2 drugs were higher, they may have, it seems, I'm amazed they weren't indicted myself.
I kind of am too, to a certain extent, but, were there, they probably never would have been convicted. Right. I do kind of find it ironic that Anna Poe is now, doing a lot of speaking and is recognized as a disaster ethics individual. But you know, from the sounds of it, she's one heck of a surgeon. But you know, when it comes to making those kind of decisions, I'm not sure, unless they're battlefield trained surgeons, whether they're the best ones to handle that. I mean, she was a reconstructive maxillofacial surgeon. It would seem to me that the pulmonary intensivists that were running the intensive care units and you know, on contract with Life Care and so forth would be the better ones, because they do handle these palliative care and compassionate withdrawal situations. But it does seem like there was a little bit of a, you know, one of the bigger problems too, I can't tell by looking at this who really was in charge, you know, from an administrative standpoint and so forth. The lines of authority kind of get blurred in a situation like this, you know. It's scary, it really is.
Also, what could be lethal to one person may not be lethal to another.
Well,
right? I mean, there is gray area.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, I might drive 80 miles an hour on, and that's certainly fine to me. But if I get pulled over, I'm in big trouble, you know. If on the New York State Thruway or the Northway or something, you know. Well, yeah, I'm driving okay, but I'm still going to get a ticket, you know. I mean, there is the law, all right. But I mean, in a case like this, the law could be debated, and like you said, this could be carried out forever, and chances are, you know, I mean, the decisions may be made in the appellate or in the you know, with various kinds of lawsuits, but I don't even think there's been successful lawsuits filed against anyone in particular. Yes?
Dr. Fink was talking about the levels of communication between federal, state, local, and the corporations that owned the, is it Lifeline?
Mm-hmm.
And
Lifestar.
And whoever owned the hospital, and trying to get the helicopters. I mean, do you have enough faith in the levels of communication that we have in this area that something on that scale could actually happen?
Well, hopefully something on that scale won't happen, but I do think we have better organization and communication. All right, mostly because the hospitals in this area are managed locally. I mean, St. Peter's Health Partners is owned and operated by Catholic Health East, but there certainly are enough decision makers, you know, in our corporate structure to be able to make the decisions that are needed in an emergency situation. The same is true, I believe, with Albany Med as well, and probably Ellis, you know. Plus we, you know, are part of the plan organized by the state of New York, and we all have our different roles to play, all right? You know, Albany Med being the trauma center in some kind of disaster situation would receive probably more of the traumatic cases. St. Peter's would probably do a large bulk of medical and cardiac and that kind of care. You know, I mean, so there is coordination, but again, we're talking about a hospital in the middle of a lake with no way to get out there, and.
Is the disaster plan was in place and they had contracts with companies that did not fulfill those contracts. So even though they had the plan, the companies said, well, sorry, you know, we don't have anybody to do this for you.
Well, you know, how many helicopters do you need to have? You know, I mean, I think it was the parent corporation for Memorial and the parent corporation for Life Care did have contracts, but you know, those helicopter companies probably had contracts with other agencies as well. And you know, that was a massive coordinated effort. Even the ground transportation. I know Mohawk Ambulance sent several rigs. I was talking to one of the ambulance guys after he came back, and he just said it was crazy. You know, they would just get calls, and they'd either do coverage in certain areas because the paid system there, the guys just needed to have a day off, or they'd be transporting from patients from one hospital to another and so forth as they were trying to get people placed. I mean, we heard a lot about the displacement of people from their homes, but, you know, hospital nursing home patients were all displaced as well. And home care patients, you know, if you're taking care of someone at home, you may have a lot of these hospital-type resources available. If you don't have power, you're sunk. You know, if you're home on a ventilator, you got maybe 12 hours worth of backup power, but you don't have a generator outside, you know, unless you bought one, all right? So there's a lot of things, Yes?
How many patients were in this hospital in the book?
I think at the time, since it was a Sunday, they were probably in the neighborhood with the NICU and the nursery and all that, probably about a little over 300. I mean, I found the hospital in its description to be very similar to the size of St. Peter's.
So 10% of the patients died, and some of them...
Which percentage-wise is an extremely high percentage.
That's very high, okay. That's
Yes. And the fact that 20 of those...
What do you think the decisions were of the medical... How did the ethical decisions of the medical staff decide that some of these people should be killed? Because they were, you know, it's against the law to kill someone.
I mean, I think the medical staff took a lot of things into their own hands and devised their own triage system. I mean, basically, it was a very simple triage system. If you could get up and move about, you were the first one out, all right? If you needed help, you were the second one out. But if you had a DNR in your chart, you weren't going anywhere. Sorry, go ahead.
But, you know, the doctors take that Hippocratic oath, and I think, you know, do no harm is really what they all are. And having worked in these stressful situations with physicians, I don't know what kind of fatigue was going on. I mean, your decision-making processes may have been way off. She may have thought, I'm helping them in some very strange way. We have to walk a mile in her shoes, and I'm certainly not defending her. But there had to be some thinking that I was helping these people. Or I can't imagine this woman who's a world-renowned surgeon, and I'm not using the word killing, would do that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and actually she was being, afterwards, when the charges came and so forth, she was, you know, being supported by Louisiana State University, because that's who had sponsored her position, all right, and actually helped her in some of the defense related costs and legal costs. It's not like the medical profession abandoned her, all right? So again, exactly what happened, how it happened, the book isn't clear on that. It really isn't. It doesn't really defend her, nor does it persecute her, all right?
Here, everybody, for coming, really appreciate it.
And thank you.